Hello and good morning, everyone. My name's Steve Feely, Director of Membership Recruitment at the Institution of Civil Engineers, indeed, as it says there. Absolutely delighted to be here at Highways UK for these 2 days, so and welcome. I think it's quite telling, really, isn't it? ICE this year is celebrating 200 years. We're having a fantastic birthday party for the whole year, of which Rachel is a big part. And actually to be here in the Midlands, I'm a proud Midlander. When you think about our very first president, indeed the often known as the Colossus of Roads, well, here we are back in the Midlands during our 200th year. So it's absolutely fantastic to be here celebrating everything civil engineers have done to deliver our highway network over the last 200 years. So from one former president to a future one, it gives me great pleasure this morning to introduce Rachel Skinner. Rachel Skinner is a Chartered Civil Engineer, Fellow and Vice President of the institution. Rachel's set to become President in November 2020 and will be the second female President and the youngest ever to hold the post. Rachel, as I'm sure many of you know, is Executive Director and Head of Development at WSP, where she leads a team of about 800 staff in redevelopment of infrastructure projects for public and private sectors. Not only that, Rachel was also one of Daily Telegraph's top 500 influential women in engineering in 2016 and the most distinguished winner of 2017 at the European Women in Construction and Engineering Awards. Absolutely delighted this morning to welcome Rachel Skinner, who's going to give us an update on our most recent State of the Nation report. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you very much. Right, so as you just heard, I'm Rachel Skinner. I'm an ICE Vice President and Exec Director at WSP. So what I want to talk to you about this morning, very briefly, is to do with our State of the Nation report, ICE's State of the Nation report. Some of you will already be aware that this is something which the ICE puts out once each year on a specific topic. So if you go back over the years, we've covered all sorts of different things. Really importantly, it's not a report that's produced sort of just by the ICE. It's not all of us sitting in a darkened room and just coming up with a load of stuff. It's actually a thing in terms of quite a lot of consultation with the industry, both public sector and private sector, national government, local, regional, and so on, in order to make sure that we're actually coming up with a considered view around what the industry is actually thinking and how we can start to form some recommendations that are genuinely useful. So this year, the topic of the State of the Nation was to do with investment and specifically to do with infrastructure investment. It was launched on the 18th of October at 1 Great George Street in London. So it's actually less than a month old now. So I guess some of you may have been to the launch event that happened there, but if not, I guess this is quite a good sort of a very condensed session in terms of figuring out what those recommendations actually are, so you can sound very knowledgeable to everybody else should they ask you about it. But the idea really this morning is to pick up on some of the key links and findings and so on as relevant specifically to what we're doing here today. So to do with the highway sector, as opposed to just trawling you through all of the detail to do with every single recommendation. I will go through each one in terms of headlines, but obviously keep it brief on I think it's 4 of them that essentially are more of a sort of a wider set of recommendations as opposed to something to do with highways. So, essentially what the State of the Nation report on investment did was look at opportunities for investment. It was intending really to open a conversation with government, with the wider industry, about how we can better fund and finance the nation's infrastructure. Some of the ideas are things you'll recognise, and it's trying to sort of catch those and keep them alive. Some of them are fairly new ideas. Some of them might sound a little bit quirky, but the idea really is they're all things that are worthy of onward investigation and so on. So it's all about looking at ways to best use the money that is invested, looking at ways to encourage new and additional finance, particularly through the private sector, and exploring essentially better ways to pay for the infrastructure that all of us rely on and use and indeed take for granted most of the time. So there are 8 recommendations altogether. 4 of them are sector-specific interventions and 4 of them are sort of cross-sector recommendations and interventions. So I will canter through those as quickly as possible. So starting off with the 4 sector-specific recommendations, the first one that is something that's actually very close to my own heart personally. I should say I didn't sit on the steering group that actually put this report together, but I did have quite a lot of input in the background in terms of some of the ideas and suggestions and so on. And I was delighted when I saw some of this kind of stuff coming out at top of the list, if you like. The very first recommendation that the report comes up with is the fact that government should give serious consideration to replacing the existing generation of road taxes with a pay-as-you-go model. Now, there's a slight rider on the end of that to do with the busiest roads in England, but actually, of course, that's something that can be taken much more widely should you wish to. So this really is built on the, I guess, the set of assumptions that I think we're all beginning to live with now much more freely than we were, say, 3 or 4 years ago, that we are on a path towards a very different road network. We're on a path towards electric vehicles. We're on a path towards connected, autonomous vehicles, shared mobility, that kind of thing. And we need to think very carefully now about what that means in terms of onward funding streams. So you'll all be aware of government commitments in terms of essentially banning the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles from 2040. That's now coming forward. We've heard about 2032 in the last few weeks from the National Infrastructure Commission. We're now hearing about 2030. It seems to be coming forward and forward and forward. And actually now we're only really dealing with something that might be 10 years away. So this is something that if we don't start planning for it now really is going to be quite an issue, because it's going to come and take us by surprise, and we have no one to blame, obviously, but ourselves, should we sit there saying, why didn't we see this coming? So essentially, for the targets around that switch to electric, or indeed sort of a post-electric fleet to be met, actually it needs a radical step change, because obviously the current models in terms of funding flows and so on are not set up to support that kind of thing. But actually that's not necessarily what the recommendation is. The recommendation itself is not about the fact that the change is happening. That's sort of implied. It's actually much more about the fact that we're going to need to raise these revenue streams through different means in order to make things work. Interestingly, as part of the research for this report, there was a sort of initial survey done of the general public to have a look at what attitudes would be should this kind of policy actually come into place. Now, you might think, and I think as engineers we often do think, that the general public would be completely against this, absolutely against any form of change and so on. You might be interested to know that actually just under half of those who were asked actually they were pretty supportive of the idea that actually roads could be used on more of a pay-as-you-go basis, so those who use them most should pay more and those who use them less should pay less. And about a quarter beyond that had no major objection to the idea. They were fairly neutral. So actually when you put all of that together, you've got 70+% of people already beginning to say, you know what, I wouldn't necessarily stand in the way of some of that kind of thing, and in fact I might actually be quite supportive of it should it actually come forward. And I think that's actually quite fascinating, because I think it slightly turns against some of the traditional assumptions that we might make about what the public understands and what they might be prepared to support. And of course that comes around in the politics directly. So I think, there's obviously a world of difference between saying you might support something and then when it actually comes in the round to, okay, we're going to do this, actually thinking about the mechanics of how it works in practice and the winners and losers and that kind of thing. But I think that's a pretty good starting point, actually, in terms of having done some research and coming up with a recommendation and then established that it wouldn't necessarily be something that would, I suppose, generate quite such political suicide, shall I say, as some might have thought maybe 5 years ago. The next one is to do with energy. Now, I will say a little bit about this one because actually, in my head at least, the worlds of energy and transport are increasingly closely linked, and again, this electric vehicles thing is really at the heart of it. So we've all seen the IPCC's climate change report, pretty shocking food for thought in there in terms of actually what's going on. I think, though, in terms of context on this one, we know we've made enormous strides in terms of renewables. We know that the contracts for difference model that's been set up over recent years is actually making a genuine difference in terms of how some of those renewable sources of energy are in fact able to come to market and are coming through much faster than they would otherwise be. So the next step, I think, and in terms of the recommendation here, it's about how you figure out how to get the energy storage piece of that into that as well. There is a lot of money going into energy storage already. There's a lot of money going in, it's things to do with battery technologies and all that kind of thing. But actually there is more that we could do to bring things through even faster. And I think the idea here is a recommendation around thinking about how you might apply the learning from the contracts for difference to bring it through in terms of energy storage. There are some fantastic examples out there in the wider world where actually a few years of sustained effort in this sort of area makes a huge difference. Norway is the obvious one in terms of electric vehicles. You may or may not know that essentially half of new vehicle registrations in Norway, admittedly at a much lower level than the UK, but half of new vehicle registrations in Norway are already for electric or hybrid vehicles, and the availability of renewables and the availability of battery storage increasingly now is making an enormous difference to that model being something that is actually sustainable and again is publicly supportable. The next two, in terms of sector-specific interventions, I won't spend too much time on today because they aren't directly roads-related. There is one to do with water asset management periods and making sure that in terms of the 5-year cycle of investment right now, that actually it's something that is sufficiently flexible to allow the really big projects to actually flow through that system without suffering from a sort of a stop-start effect. The fourth one is to do with rail, and it's to do with the fact that at the moment there is an encouragement for market-led proposals to come through. But actually there is a perception perhaps in the industry that people are sharing some of their great ideas as they tender for projects and so on, and sometimes those great ideas essentially end up if I'm being kind, being borrowed by others, and then others end up delivering them, as opposed to the people who actually had the idea in the first place, which of course doesn't really propagate the sharing of ideas in a long-term sense. So I think there is a need for a different model in terms of actually allowing the IP, I suppose, that people are actually generating to make sure it sticks with the people who genuinely deserve to be able to take that through. So those are the 4 sector-specific interventions. If we come on to the other 4 recommendations in the report, they are more general cross-sector policy recommendations for government. So the first one of those is to do with the, essentially to do with the European Investment Bank and the fact that with Brexit going on, there is a really interesting trend going on behind the scenes where 31.3 billion euros were invested between 2012 and 2016 in key UK energy, transport and waste management projects. So that's European Investment Bank funding that we've been able to rely on over the last few years in order to bring through investment and infrastructure projects here. That's around about 10% of the financing for the National Infrastructure Delivery Plan to 2021. However, since a certain vote happened in 2016, since the Brexit outcome and so on was known, this actually has dropped by 72%, which of course is huge in the space of a couple of years. So actually less than 2 billion was invested in 2017, just to give you an idea of the scale of change there. So the recommendation here is that clearly that's not okay. The point of the European Investment Bank is around making sure that investments that might otherwise have appeared a little bit risky actually are underpinned and have I guess a certain level of security attached to them that other investors can then look at and say, yeah, you know what, if the EIB is investing, that's fine, I will come into the game as well. Without that, it's going to be very difficult to attract those sorts of investment models going forward. So the recommendation is that we should think about establishing something like a UK investment bank, so an equivalent model of our own. It doesn't necessarily have to be along exactly the same lines, but it does need to make sure that it's picking up on what was successful in terms of the EIB model, the European model, and making sure that we don't lose that, because obviously it is a fundamental piece of what we actually do. So I think really this is around some exploratory work. It's about understanding what the options are, but it's making sure that actually happens quite quickly, because otherwise, right now, in the last 2 years, we've already seen that drop in funding, and the longer it is before we have something else in place, obviously the longer it will be before it's actually something that can be fixed. There are really successful models elsewhere in the world. Germany has a very similar model that actually operates already and is seen to be pretty successful in terms of bringing through infrastructure, so there's no reason why that couldn't continue. The second one is to do with looking at alternative funding and financing mechanisms, and there's some quite quirky ideas in here. If you take a look at the detailed report, I think the idea is that there's probably no one single model in terms of investment that actually is going to be the magic answer, if you like, in terms of actually how we bring through extra sources of funding and finance to go forward. But there are all sorts of interesting ideas that are out there which in combination might be useful. So things like asset recycling, the idea that we have assets that are worth something already, we could potentially lease or even sell those to the private sector in some form of model, and then obviously we can get something back from that which allows us to use that funding to invest onwards in other infrastructure. Obviously it needs to be thought through, obviously we need to be careful how we do that, but there is a model there which has been used in the past and which we could carry on using. There's a piece around land value capture, in terms of recognising that where we invest in infrastructure, land values do tend to rise. We only have to look at the Jubilee line, where there's 30% rise in property values along that line, or indeed Crossrail, where already we've seen a 50% increase in residential density within 500 metres of the stations before the scheme even opens, and indeed also a rise in commercial land values along the route of the scheme. All of that we can only expect to carry on, and clearly there is a benefit to be had through being near to some of these major infrastructure schemes. So the idea of land value capture, the idea of really making that mechanism work much better, is something which is definitely worth exploration. And the third one, which is slightly more wacky, I guess, in most of our eyes perhaps, but is something that genuinely is out there and is being used, is to do with crowdfunding. Obviously we don't associate, I suppose, major infrastructure with crowdfunding ideas and so on, but there are actually examples already out there, perhaps at a slightly smaller scale, where bits of infrastructure are in fact being funded or seed funded by things like this, which is fantastic. You may be surprised to know that crowdfunding generally, nothing to do with infrastructure, just generally in the UK, those who are in the UK interested in this kind of a model actually invested £4.6 billion in 2016 in this sort of model. So it's not actually that alien an idea. There are people out there who have money to invest, and obviously infrastructure is a pretty good bet. And that's, I guess, partly thanks to all of us, but it is actually genuinely quite a good bet in terms of a secure return and so on. So it's certainly worth consideration, probably at a more local level, regional level and so on, in terms of schemes that need to get off the ground. The final two are ones I'll go through more briefly. There was a piece in terms of the engagement and the consultation that went on around the production of the State of the Nation report. There was a very strong feeling that the National Infrastructure Commission should be placed on a statutory footing. So it's less, I guess, politically sort of sensitive in terms of any major shifts in government that may come forward in future. I think there's mixed views on this one in the round. I think though it is an interesting point though that generally people are seeing that it has value. It clearly is something that is actually giving that edge of independence, I guess, in terms of what's actually going on, and clearly they're putting out products that are useful in terms of government and in terms of the marketplace and investors and so on. So we'll see where that one goes. I think it's certainly, again, something that is worth exploring. And the final one is to do with the National Infrastructure and Construction Pipeline, which is something that the IPA holds and keeps together and so on. I think there's a feeling there we have a pipeline of projects. We have things that are fairly detailed up to 2021, but of course that's not very far into the future. So I think there's a general feeling that actually a little bit of work to try and add a bit of detail to that, to try and help investors to actually understand the ideas and make sure they're able to see more clearly what potentially those investment opportunities might be for the longer term, are things that would be really very, very useful. So that is a whistle-stop tour through the 8 key recommendations of the State of the Nation investment. As I say, it's less than a month old, so it's all still fairly new. I think it's been well received, generally speaking, so far, which is fantastic. And obviously there's a long way to run in terms of trying to figure out ways for the ICE, in collaboration with all sorts of other partners, to bring through some of these recommendations over the rest of this year and indeed beyond. Thank you very much.
Hello,
Hi.
Rachel. I'm
Hi.
Ross Fairley from Burgess Allen.
Hi.
I was interested in that recommendation on storage because I come
Yes.
very much from the more energy side, the transport side. I've got transport colleagues here, but I'm the interloper. I'm on the energy side. And your comment about storage and incentivising storage, I think you make a very good point that the interlink between transport and energy. But unfortunately, our energy policy in the UK is completely at odds with what we're trying to do on the transport side and encouraging storage. Because what the energy policy is to drive it down to the lowest cost for the consumer, which is the number one priority for government. And that doesn't actually necessarily work if you want to put the infrastructure in, which is going to future-proof EVs and connected autonomous vehicles. So there's a real dilemma there, and I'm not seeing any light at the end of the tunnel in terms of a change in gear on the energy side. I think it's still driving everything down to the lowest cost. And actually, you mentioned CFDs. The whole purpose of CFDs is to drive down the costs of low carbon generation.
Sure.
In actual fact, it's been incredibly successful for offshore wind, but it's completely killed other renewables. So there's a real dilemma there between the two policies on the transport side and the energy side, and I still don't see they're talking to each other. It's an observation, sorry.
No, I think it's an interesting point though, because actually I think you're absolutely right, and I suspect if you go back not very many years, that separation didn't matter so much. Because actually what was going on in the transport space was one thing, and what was going on in the energy space was another thing. And actually in terms of policy making and in terms of objectives and outcomes and so on, one didn't necessarily knock onto the other quite so directly. And I think what I'm seeing that's of interest, and I'm sort of agreeing really with everything you've just said in terms of commenting there. What I think is interesting is that now we almost can't avoid the fact that these two things are crashing into each other. There is no doubt that in terms of the electric vehicle market, there is a demand, there is a public interest, and there is going to be potentially a problem that we create for ourselves if we don't figure out a way to smooth the demand for energy as and when we all have these vehicles that we want to plug in. It'll be a very different model to this idea where at the moment, you go and you fill up your car at the petrol, diesel at the motorway services or whatever it is you do. Obviously, if you like the storage in that thing is sort of implied within the whole system that's actually set up. This thing around energy supply into that transport market and it being so fundamental to keeping the vehicles on the network and running and moving, and of course it's freight as well as light vehicles as well, is something which I guess I would hope it will start to force that conversation to happen for maybe a different set of reasons. So, I mean, I guess the commercial aspect, the pricing aspect is always going to come into play. To a certain extent, it kind of has to, doesn't it? Because we can't really be seen to be doing anything that's dramatically different to that. But I think perhaps the motivation in terms of, why is it this matters now and what are the outcomes we're actually looking for, that perhaps is very different, because I think, at risk of giving a very long answer to your comment, the other piece that clearly is important to an awful lot of government departments right now is things around air quality. And I think that the air quality piece and its link to electric vehicles and the potential benefit in terms of the everyday public perception of what difference we could actually make is something which is pretty powerful. And that lever is right there now And if we don't grab it quite quickly, we'll kind of miss the boat. So I think, now is probably the time. But yeah, it's not going to be straightforward.
Hi Rachel,
Hiya.
Damien McGettrick. I guess I'm working for an SME. I see that the innovations, the sort of value, the things that they can offer isn't always picked up with the sort of tier one sort of suppliers. And whilst everyone says, like you say, the IP type of, we'll do that, we can do all of these things, we still see a bit of a barrier sometimes in actually engaging, having the conversation where we think we can provide a good solution.
Yeah.
And it's back to maybe the previous question, the cost is always seen as the real driving force as opposed to the value you get out at the end of it. So I like the fact that this IP thing could be recognised. I went to a presentation last night on the Queensferry crossing where we actually were involved with that, and refreshingly heard how the original bidders were reimbursed for all their costs. We're talking millions of pounds here. I know it is done on other contracts. But really, as a way to say, look, we really want your ideas. We really want you to give us some good suggestions, and you'll get reimbursed for it, even if you're not successful. Just wonder if that's been picked up as well in the State of the Nation.
Sure. I don't know if explicitly that particular point came through, but I do know from conversations I've had, for example, with the National Infrastructure Commission and others, that is very much a thing that is recognised and it is quite real. And I think there is an acknowledgement that very often some of those great ideas do end up at the moment, unfortunately, getting lost in the noise or not being given credit where it's due and that kind of thing, which is a real shame, isn't it? I guess it's partly on all of us, isn't it, to make sure that everybody is doing what they need to do to bring the ideas through and also give that credit. But I guess maybe it's a bit of a nudge in the direction of certain government departments and certain commissioners, shall we suggest, that actually could bring that through much more strongly. I think certainly the NIC. There is a good link there in terms of making those suggestions. There's certainly some live, actions that are resting with them right now that could actually be quite interesting in that regard, particularly coming back. I guess it's kind of an NIC IPA effort, but the thing around needing to form a more detailed pipeline of projects and so on, where there are ideas that are still slightly just a glimmer in the eye or a different way of doing things or a different kind of solution, maybe we need to get a bit braver about putting some of those out there, recognising that some might fall away, and that's kind of fine. But if we don't put them out there and acknowledge them as real ideas, then it might be that much more difficult to bring them through and actually turn them into investable options, I guess, going forward. Yeah.
Morning, Rachel. Andy Tovey from WSP.
Oh, hello. I was trying to work out. I knew you were there, but I didn't know where the voice was coming from.
Just an observation, really, to reinforce what you were saying a little bit regarding road user charges and pay-as-you-go.
Yeah.
I was reading an article this morning over breakfast where there's an insurance company now who are doing pay-as-you-go effectively for your mileage.
Yes.
So you
Yes.
base charge for fire and theft, and everything else is charged on the amount of miles that you drive. And also being in the enviable situation of having a teenage daughter wanting to drive, similar things with that as well, where you actually just pay to insure your car for the hour and a half you brave to take her out on the network. So there seems to be a bit more of an increasing acceptance for that type of mechanism these days.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think I'd even go beyond transport as well. I think we're all very used to paying for a lot of things now in a kind of a bundled or a pay-as-you-go kind of way, aren't we? If you think about mobile phone contracts, TV, internet contracts, we've probably all got at home, but also things to do with travel and passes and all that kind of season tickets and so on. There's all kinds of new models coming to market in terms of how it works, and I think you're right. The insurance one is interesting though in terms of driving, because there was some of these ideas beginning to bubble a little while ago, and actually the insurers were beginning to recognise that some people who really don't drive very much are actually a far greater risk than those who drive all the time. So you're absolutely right. There's, you can sort of stack it one way, but then you can also look at it in terms of the risk, and it comes back around the other way. I have no comments on your teenage daughter learning to drive. Mine aren't that old yet, so I'm looking forward to that, maybe, or not. But there we go. No, I think we can absolutely expect to see all kinds of changes. The other big thing that's going on in the transport space, and I guess the vehicle insurance space at the moment, are conversations to do with essentially who's taking the risk and to what extent the fleet manufacturers actually are beginning to make much more of a promise in terms of the clever kit essentially that's on board some of the vehicles, and at what point is some responsibility going to be held by them in terms of the performance and the function of these different bits of kit, you know, whether it's the lane following or the automatic braking or the, you know, parking sensors or the, you know, the self-parking things and all the rest of the things that are increasingly on board all of our new vehicles already. And I think that is going to be an interesting space to watch as well, because, you know, at what point does it stop being the driver's responsibility, and at what point do we hand that over entirely in the longer run to something that is fully automated? I mean, who knows? It's some really interesting stuff in that space. Yeah.
Hi, Rachel.
Hello. It's very difficult because you all sound like you're coming from the same place.
I'm Joe McGuire from Mark McDonald.
Hi.
I'm a civil
Yes.
engineer.
Hello.
My concern really is about vulnerable users with this pay-as-you-go electric vehicle, because they're not cheap hybrid vehicles, and some people rely on driving as a means to, you know, access work, get opportunities, and if we start to increase the price, you know, the same concern for small businesses, you know, how has that been really addressed?
Sure.
You know, has there been a concern about that?
Yeah. So we're sort of stepping slightly away from the, I guess, the ICE elements of the report, but it's a good question. I don't think there is any implied increase in cost to users that comes through with all of this. At the moment, there are all sorts of rebates available for things to do with electric vehicles. You get all kinds of incentives. We're trying to push them, aren't we, as a nation, in terms of trying to encourage people to move towards them as a possible option. Obviously, in time, that might well change. And if you think about income streams from things to do with fuel duty and licensing and all the rest of it, clearly we aren't going to be able to roll forward with a thing that has zero income. And that's really where that pay-as-you-go recommendation comes from, is that perhaps instead of just saying, well, we'll just loop, you know, this class of vehicles back into that system again, perhaps it's time to rethink it. The fact that we have the potential to use the data that's going to be increasingly available to us as vehicles become more connected, as we know more about what people are actually doing, means that it is entirely possible to come to a totally new model of figuring out, you know, who actually has essentially got a responsibility for what element of cost in terms of their use of the network. That is something which, I guess, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we couldn't have done it. The data didn't exist. It would have been very, very clunky. I mean, you know, that's why a lot of the toll-based systems that exist now are based on, you know, point-based tolling or, you know, link-based tolling and so on, because actually it wouldn't have been possible to do anything else. But we now have the opportunity to do something very different and much more clever, I think. So I think if we get it right, we won't be disadvantaging people who, you know, either have no other options or who particularly need certain things. In fact, if anything, if we get it right, I guess we might even fine-tune it the other way around. So in fact, those who need to be moving around and genuinely have no other options are most able to, if that makes sense. Yeah. Thank you very much. I'll be around for a little bit, so if anybody wants to come and have a talk about any of the other recommendations, then please do. Obviously, there's a full, very detailed report available online. I'm sure Steve has many copies of it, perhaps available, I don't know. Anyway, yes, if anybody's interested in reading the full report, please do, and obviously get back in touch with the ICE if you want to know any more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So on behalf of the ICE, thank you very much for coming. Thanks to our friends at Burgess Salmon, who've very kindly given us this splendid theatre for the first half an hour. Thank you for that. Thanks for coming. What a fantastic start to the day. Thank you, Rachel. I know you are so busy over these next 2 days. These 2 days. Thanks for finding the time to come and see us. Really looking forward to your year of president. Come back and see us again, please. Thanks all. Have a great day. Thank you.